Hi, in this video, Sayali and Nidhi explain how they arrived at their problem definition. They share their experiences of participating in the first design workshop held at TISS.
How we came up with our problem statement during the last workshop. So when, as you all know, we were a participant in the last workshop. So when we were told to come up with a problem that we would want to solve using an activity or a game, uh, we said, so where do we start? So the first thing was that we thought, let us think about what is it that we are currently doing, and what is it that we know, and do we see a problem that we think is important and needs to be solved, and maybe there haven't been a lot of attempts in this way to solve it, like using maybe a game or an activity. So our background was that I had engaged quite a bit with adolescent children in from slums or marginalized communities, and also when we were creating online content for teachers. So we got to study the adolescent brain and how the changes in the brain reflect in behavior. So this was what our background was, and so our experience was that the adolescent children seemed very quickly, they resorted to violence as a means of solving conflicts. And we could also see that when we understood the working of the adolescent brain. So we understood that there's this part called neocortex in the brain, which is still developing in the adolescent stage. And they uh, the capability for self-regulation is still developing. The other thing is that they take risks very frequently. I mean, if I were to rate a certain risk to be 10, they would rate it to be 2. So they do not really gauge the amount of risk that is involved in any activity, and immediate pleasures appeal more to them than long-term disadvantages. So this is what we knew about the adolescent brain, and we saw that these children were very quick to react violently to solve even small problems with each other. So we thought, why not take this as a problem that we would want to address, that we would want to design a solution for, and then see how can we go about designing an activity or game to solve that the fact that children resort to violence very easily for as a means of conflict resolution. So the initial problem definitions, we went through an iterative process of defining the problem. So the initial definition was very broad. It just said inquiry of non-violence as a means of conflict resolution for adolescents. But then when we started thinking this, we got inputs from the facilitators, and they started asking us questions, and we realized, oh, this is too broad. Uh, let us uh, let us go deeper and see. So when we talk of adolescence, which particular age group are we thinking about? So then we said it is from the ages 12 to 15. That is also because we had engaged more with that age group. Then we said, what kind of adolescents, like who are these adolescents? So we said they are coming from marginalized communities. Uh, but then we also realized after talking to people is that marginalized communities are very different. Like a community in the village is the behavior, the way they think might be very different from the ones staying in cities. So then we specified and we said that, okay, we want to design it for the adolescents who are staying in urban slums. And further on, we went on to say that it is urban slums of Pune, that is because we had experience from that part. So we said, let us make it even more specific and say it is urban slums of Pune. Eventually, we also thought about whether what we were thinking of, the solution that we were thinking of, is something to be implemented in school, or it is to be done after school in a sort of khelghar sort of setup, so that those thoughts came to us later on. So then we said, okay, fine, for now I think this is good enough. We should go ahead with this. So when we stopped at this definition, and we said that, okay, to in order to be able to design an activity or a game which serves the purpose as has been written in blue, what should be the objectives of that activity or the game. And I've just mentioned four, but there were a lot of them. So they have to identify what is a conflict situation. They have to extrapolate the consequences of violent and non-violent means of conflict resolution. They had to come up with non-violent means of conflict resolution. They had to evaluate that in a given situation, uh, if there are two ways of going about handling the conflict, which one should one take. So and even these are slightly refined versions. Initially we just had questions like, what is conflict, what is violence, and after talking to the facilitators, we said, okay, it that
It shows
when we say learner should be able to, there has
the
to be an action
activity.
item to the objective. So then we thought of what action do we want um, the player or the participants to take. And then we so these are four of them that I've written here. And then we said, okay, good enough, let us go ahead with this. So the initial game structure, in order to be able to achieve all these four objectives, was that the players will be given everyday conflict scenarios, and then they would be asked how would they react in those situations. For example, a biker accidentally hits the player's cycle, and she falls down and bruises her knee. So how will she react to this situation? And then how the choice that she will make will in turn affect her health, career prospects, and relationships. And then how those choices, like how we'll be presenting more scenarios, and the player would be making choices every time, and every time we'll see how it affects the player holistically, and also the other characters involved in that situation. So if a biker hits her, then what happens to the biker if she reacts violently? uh, so what we realized was that it was too huge. It was very big. I mean, there were a lot of characters, there were a lot of choices. We
Okay.
had to keep track of what happened to whom, and sometimes I mean, it's not necessary that something happens then and there. Maybe the effects of the choices manifest, very late in the life of people. So we started getting this feeling that this is getting very complicated, and we will not be able to deal with such a complicated activity or game. So then what we thought is that let's go back to our problem definition, and can we pick up one small thing, one small aspect, and develop an activity for it. So what we did was we revised our problem statement, or I would rather call it a task statement. And so here we said that we want to develop a game. So earlier we hadn't mentioned what it is, what kind of activity it is. So we now said we want to develop a game to engage adolescents. And by adolescents, we meant girls and boys both, aged 12 to 15, from urban slums of Pune. And in the inquiry of the question, what is violence? So we narrowed down what we were thinking of to just one small question: what is violence? And in the process of that inquiry, as a byproduct, they would also be able to inspect their own actions and those of around them, and imagine how they might affect people. But the key focus of the game or the activity would be just this one small question: what is violence? And then we based on this revised task statement, we wrote out objectives wherein the learner should be able to define what is violence, then critically evaluate the actions of people and judge them to be violent or not violent, and then extrapolate the effects of the actions on the people involved in the action. So these were the three objectives that we kept in our mind then. And then we went on to redesign what our earlier game was. So in the new design, what we did was is that, so we also realized that it can't be I mean, you can't in a vacuum asking somebody to define what is violence. uh, I mean, why do I want to do that could be a very natural response. So we thought maybe there has to be some context to it, some backstory to it, something that maybe the children might like. The game that we came up with was that I mean, Akbar and Birbal are two characters which are generally known to adolescents or children in general, and Akbar is the king. So Akbar is sitting in the court, and his ministers are divided over whether there is a lot of violence in the state, and they can't make up their mind, and so they call up Birbal, who's a minister in Akbar's court, to find out the reality. And then Birbal says, okay, I'll take a tour around the state, and I will observe, make observations, and then I'll come back and report to you. And so when Birbal decides to take the tour of the state, he thinks to himself, uh, if I have to see whether there is a lot of violence in the state, I first need to define to myself what is violence. I first need to ask myself what is violence, so that I can, count cases of violence. So at this point, the player who is playing the Birbal has to write down her own definition of what is violence, and the player is given 3 marbles at the start. So as Birbal progresses on the board game, she's given different scenarios, and she has to, in each scenario, the player as Birbal has to think about whether she intuitively feels that the act is violent, and if the act is violent, whether it is covered in her definition of what she calls violence. And if she thinks that, oh, this act is violent, but this definition is inadequate to cover it, she can choose to change her definition, and in exchange for a marble. So and if she thinks that no, the definition is enough to cover the act and call it as violent or non-violent, then she just proceeds. So there initially we started with 6 scenarios, and if the player has to change a definition more than 3 times, then she loses all the marbles, and eventually the player loses. So that was the game design that we thought of. And these are some of these scenarios that we thought of, like for a very clear case where Birbal sees an elder brother beating his younger sister, and the brother claims that sister used his toys. And so when then the player would be asked questions about why she thinks something is this particular scenario, who is the perpetrator, why does she think it is violent, it is a violent act or it is not a violent act, and compare it to her definition, and then see if there is a gap. So in general, the point was to think consciously about violence and look at each act that we perform uh, in our day-to-day life, and think whether there is violence involved in that act. So this is what we hope to achieve at the end of the game. So these are some of these scenarios. Now actually the game has been changed quite a lot, because we play tested the game with a lot of groups, and we got feedback from the groups. Some of them said that the Akbar Birbal story doesn't work. Some of them say that said that the incentive structure for the game was not right. So eventually now the game has been changed quite a lot. The objectives and like the problem statement or the task statement still remains the same, but the structure of the game has been changed a lot. um, so but that is for some other time, because it's very elaborate, and explaining that structure would take a lot of time. So yeah, I sorry, I didn't.
Voice is breaking. Yeah.
we're not able to hear you.
Bindu, we are not also able to hear you. I think there is a problem of connection at your part. Please check.
Okay, then that's fine. Yeah, continue, please.
Yeah, so actually, so I would say this is where we were at the end of the workshop, where we had a certain level of problem statement defined, and two or three important objectives that we wanted to achieve articulated, and a game design to support that. Eventually, when we developed a prototype and we went on and play tested it, like I said, uh, things changed depending on the feedback that we got, and we had to modify the game structure a bit. But the crux of the game more or less remained the same. So I think by the end of the workshop, this is a photo of the prototype that we had. We also had those figures, which I unfortunately I couldn't find a better photograph of the session. But that is how we went about thinking about like our problem, is what I would say.